The wind came low and dry across the plains, a lonely sound that scraped the dust from the hardpan and carried the scent of nothing. It was the land's own breath, shallow and weary. At the edge of the settlement, which was little more than a collection of weary buildings squinting under the brutal sun, the train station stood like a monument to departures. It was a place of endings, not beginnings. Elias Thorne stood on the warped platform, a man built to the scale of the mountains that loomed on the horizon, immense and silent. He did not belong here. His world was one of fences and sky, of the heft of an axe and the solitude of his own making. He came to town only when necessity drove him, a ghost moving through a world he no longer wished to be a part of. He collected the sacks of flour and salt, his movements deliberate, saying no more than was required. But then he saw her. She was huddled on a bench at the far end of the platform, a thing made of shadows and fear. An Apache woman, her belly swollen with a child to come. She was a stone in a stream, the current of hostile glances and muttered words flowing around her, wearing her down. Her stillness was a scream no one could hear. Elias watched the station master shoo her away with a gesture, his face a mask of pinched disgust. He saw the women of the town pull their children closer, their virtue a flimsy shield against the sight of her. In her, Elias saw not an intruder, but a reflection. He saw the same profound isolation that had been his only companion for 3 years. He saw the brand of the outcast, a mark he wore on the inside. His grief was a vast, quiet country, and he had posted sentinels at all its borders. Yet, he found himself walking toward her. His shadow fell over her first, a sudden eclipse. She flinched, her dark eyes rising to his, expecting a blow, a curse, another shove toward the edge of the world. Her face was a map of hardship, drawn with lines of exhaustion and a resilience that was almost terrifying. He said nothing for a long moment, the wind filling the space between them. His own voice felt like a rusted tool. Then, the words came, hard and definite, with no room for argument. "You're coming with me." The journey to his ranch was carved from silence. The wagon wheels groaned a constant complaint against the ruts of the trail, a sound that seemed to measure the vast, unspoken distance between the two figures on the bench. Elias held the reins in his huge, scarred hands, his gaze fixed on the endless horizon where the pale sky met the scorched earth. He was aware of her beside him, a tense, coiled presence. She did not look at him. Her eye scanned the passing landscape, the skeletal remains of Yucca, the heat shimmer rising from the ground like a departing soul. She was reading the land, gauging its dangers, its possibilities. He had seen that look before, in cornered animals. But there was something else there, too. A watchfulness that was not just fear, but a deep, ingrained habit of observation. He noted the way she held herself, protecting the life within her, her posture a fierce and silent declaration of survival. The sun beat down, a physical weight. Dust, fine as powdered bone, settled on them, a shared blanket of grit. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask how she had come to be alone at that station, a solitary island in a sea of contempt. The questions were wounds, and he had no right to probe them. He knew what it was to have a story that was too heavy to be carried in words. His own story was a silence that filled his house, that sat with him at his empty table. As the sun began to bleed across the western sky, staining the clouds in shades of rust and violet, they crested a low rise. Below them lay his homestead. It was not a place of comfort. It was a place of order, of stark utility. A small, solid cabin, a barn, and a web of fences stretching out into the emptiness. It was a testament to one man's war against chaos, a solitary fortress against memory. He brought the wagon to a halt near the porch. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world had gone quiet, save for the sighing of the wind through the eaves of the barn. He got down, his boots thudding on the hard-packed earth. He didn't offer a hand, but waited. After a pause that felt as long as the journey itself, she slid down from the wagon, landing with a soft sound. She stood there, small against the immense backdrop of his land, looking at the cabin not as a refuge, but as another cage. He led her inside. The air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and soap. He gestured to a small room off the main living space. It held a simple cot with a clean, folded blanket. "Here," he said. It was all he said. She looked from the cot to his face, searching for the trick, the price. She found nothing but a weariness that matched her own. The first days were a careful dance of avoidance. Time was measured not by the clock on the mantelpiece, its hands had been still for years, but by the sun's slow march across the sky and the shifting of shadows on the cabin floor. Elias rose before dawn, the habit of a lifetime of work ingrained in his bones. He would move through the pre-dawn gloom, his large frame silent, and light the stove. The smell of coffee and frying bacon would fill the small house, a lonely ritual he had performed for 1,000 solitary mornings. Now, it was a question. An offering he didn't know how to make. He would leave a plate on the scrubbed pine table before heading out to the barn, to the endless cycle of mending, feeding, and tending that gave his life its shape. When he returned hours later, the plate would be empty, washed, and set neatly by the dry sink. He never saw her eat. He only saw the evidence of her presence, like the trace of a ghost. She remained in her room, or moved about the house with a quietness that was absolute. He would catch glimpses of her, a shadow passing a window, the briefest sight of her sitting on the porch steps, her hands resting on her belly as she watched the horizon. She studied his world with an unnerving intensity. She learned the rhythm of his days, the sound of his footsteps, the way he would pause and stare at the western ridge, his face hardening into a mask of old pain. She saw the order in his life, the fierce control he exerted over his small patch of earth, and understood it was a defense. The silence between them was a living thing. It was not an empty silence, but one thick with unspoken histories. It was a landscape of its own, with treacherous gullies and high, lonely mesas. Sometimes, in the evenings, he would sit by the fire, oiling leather, or sharpening a tool, and she would sit at the far end of the room, her hands busy with some small piece of mending. They were two separate islands, the firelight flickering in the vast ocean between them. He knew the town would be talking. The sheriff would come. Elias Thorne, the hermit, the man who had buried his heart with his wife and child, had brought an Apache squaw to his home. The judgment would be swift and merciless. He had shattered his own isolation, and in doing so, had invited the world and its ugliness back to his door. He did not care. Or rather, he cared so much about the memory he was protecting that he would not allow it to be tainted by turning away someone who needed shelter. His protection of her became an extension of the protection of his own grief. One afternoon, a sudden summer squall blew in, the sky turning the color of a fresh bruise. The wind howled, rattling the windows in their frames. Elias was in the barn, securing a loose shutter when his gaze fell upon it. Tucked away in a dusty corner, half hidden beneath a stiff canvas torp, was a small wooden horse. Its paint was faded and chipped, one of its rockers split. He ran a hand over the smooth, worn wood of its head, and the silence in his heart roared to life. He saw a small pair of hands clutching that neck, heard a shriek of laughter that the wind could not mimic. He saw his wife, Sarah, standing in the doorway of the barn, her face bright with love, watching their son ride his imaginary steed across the plains of a barn floor. The memory was so sharp, so clear, it was a physical blow. He sank down onto a hay bale, the great strength seeming to drain out of him, leaving him hollowed and old. He didn't know how long he sat there, lost in the ghost-haunted landscape of the past, the storm outside a pale echo of the one within. When he finally looked up, she was standing in the wide doorway of the barn, rain dripping from her dark hair. She had come to find him, drawn by his prolonged absence. She said nothing. Her eyes went from his face, to his hand on the rocking horse, and back to his face. And in that moment, she saw it all. She saw the reason for the empty chair, the silent clock, the profound and aching solitude of this giant of a man. She had seen that look in the eyes of her own people after a massacre, the look of someone who is still living but has been left behind. She took a half-step forward, then stopped. There were no words in her language, or his, that could bridge such a chasm. Instead, she turned and walked back to the house through the rain. Later that evening, after their silent meal, he found one of his work shirts laid out on his cot. A long, ragged tear in the sleeve, one he'd ignored for weeks, had been stitched closed. The stitches were small, neat, and impossibly strong. It was not an apology for intruding on his grief. It was an acknowledgement. A quiet recognition of his wound, from a woman who was covered in her own. He picked up the shirt, the rough fabric soft in his calloused fingers. The mended seam was a line of kinship, a thread of understanding woven into the fabric of their shared silence. The hoofbeats came 2 days later, a hard, official rhythm against the packed earth. Elias was splitting firewood, the axe rising and falling in a steady, metronomic beat. He didn't stop. He knew who it was. Sheriff Brody swung down from his horse, a man whose authority was worn like an ill-fitting coat. He hitched his belt and surveyed the homestead, his eyes lingering on the cabin door. "Thorn," he said, his voice carrying an easy contempt. Elias sank the axe into the chopping block and turned slowly. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He did not speak. "Heard you picked up some stray baggage in town," Brody said, gesturing with his chin toward the house. "Folks are concerned. It ain't right, you having one of them out here." Elias's eyes, the color of a winter sky, remained fixed on the sheriff. They revealed nothing. "She's no concern of theirs," he said. The words were flat, like stones dropped into a deep well. Brody shifted his weight. Elias's stillness was unnerving. Men who shouted were predictable. Silent men held things back, and that was dangerous. "Look, Elias. We all know what happened to you. What happened with Sarah and the boy. But this," he waved a hand dismissively. "This is different. That's an Apache. There's been trouble up north. Raids. We don't need that kind of trouble brought down here." Inside the cabin, Nolin stood by the window, concealed by the curtain. She could not hear all the words, but she understood the tone. It was the voice of the soldier, the agent, the man who decided who lived and who died, who belonged and who was dirt. She watched Elias. He did not move, did not flinch. He was a mountain, immovable, weathering the small, angry storm that was the sheriff. "There's no trouble here, Sheriff," Elias said, his voice low and final. "This is my land." The implication was clear. What happened on his land was his business. Brody's face tightened. He was used to deference, to the fear his badge inspired. He got none of it from Thorn. "You mark my words," Brody spat, turning back to his horse. "You're asking for it. When it comes, don't you come crying to me." He swung into the saddle and rode away, kicking up a plume of indignant dust. Elias watched him go, his jaw a hard line. He had drawn a line in the sand, not just for the sheriff, but for himself. He had chosen a side. He turned and his eyes met the window where he knew she was watching. He held her gaze for a long second, a silent acknowledgement. She let the curtain fall, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. For the first time since she had fled the ruins of her life, she felt the barest flicker of something that was not fear. It felt, strangely, like safety. A week later, the sky turned a sullen yellow and the wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain and distant lightning. A summer storm, fierce and sudden, swept across the plains, tearing at the land with a wild fury. By morning, the world was washed clean, but a section of the northern fence line was down, the posts snapped like twigs. Elias gathered his tools, his movements economical and sure. He would spend the day rebuilding. As he loaded the wagon, he heard the soft sound of the cabin door opening. Nolin stood on the porch, a worn shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She watched him for a moment, then walked slowly toward the wagon. He stopped, waiting. "I can help," she said. Her voice was soft, but firm. It was the most she had said to him at one time. He looked at her, at the full curve of her belly. "It's heavy work, I can hold things," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "I will not break." He saw the quiet defiance in her eyes, the need to contribute, to not be a burden. It was a matter of pride, a thing he understood completely. He nodded once. The work was slow and arduous. The sun beat down, turning the damp earth to steam. He dug the post holes, his muscles coiling and releasing in a familiar rhythm. She worked beside him, her silence a comfortable weight. She passed him tools without being asked, her observational wisdom anticipating his needs. She held the new post steady while he tamped the earth around them, her small hands surprisingly strong. They did not talk of their pasts, or their fears, or the child that was soon to come. They talked of the work. A little to the left, he would murmur, and she would adjust the post. The wire stretcher, she would say, and he would find it already in her hand. The shared task became a language of its own. In the rhythm of the hammer, in the strain of pulling the wire taut, they built something more than a fence. They were mending the broken boundary between them. They were creating a shared space, defined not by the walls of the cabin, but by the sweat and effort of a common goal. In the late afternoon, as he drove the last staple, they stood back and looked at the new fence. It was a straight, strong line against the vastness of the prairie. A boundary made together. He looked at her, her face smudged with dirt, her body tired but her spirit unbent. A small, genuine smile touched the corners of his mouth. She saw it, and a flicker of a smile answered him in return. It was a fragile thing, but it was real. In the quiet of that shared smile, the great, silent weight between them seemed to lighten, just for a moment. The nights were when the ghosts came for her. They came on the silent feet of memory, whispering in a language of smoke and blood. She would be back in the canyon, the air thick with gunfire and screams. She would see her husband fall, his face a mask of surprise. She would feel the cold terror of the flight, the sharp rocks under her feet, the burning in her lungs. She would wake with a gasp, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, the scent of phantom smoke filling the small, dark room. One night, the dream was worse than usual. A guttural cry was torn from her throat before she could stifle it. In the main room, Elias was woken from his own shallow sleep. He sat up, his body instantly tense, listening. He heard the muffled sound of her weeping, a raw, broken sound that echoed the emptiness in his own soul. He rose from his cot and went to her door, his big hand resting on the cool wood. He did not open it. He did not intrude. He simply stood there, a silent sentinel in the dark, his presence a shield against the terrors of the night. He was guarding her not from any physical threat, but from the phantoms of her own mind. He stood there until the weeping subsided, replaced by the deep, even breaths of exhausted sleep. He knew that pain. He knew the way the past could ambush you in the quiet of the night, leaving you breathless and broken. The next morning, when he came to the table for his coffee, a small object sat beside his tin cup. It was a bird, carved from a scrap of soft cartonwood. It was no bigger than his thumb, but the detail was exquisite. The wings were poised for flight, the head cocked as if listening for a distant song. It was a thing of impossible delicacy and grace, created by hands that knew both sorrow and beauty. He picked it up, the smooth wood warm against his rough skin. He understood. It was not a payment. It was a story. It was a message of thanks. It was a piece of her spirit, offered in trust. He closed his hand around the small bird, its fragile shape a solid weight in his palm. He looked toward her closed door and nodded once, to himself. A silent transaction had been completed, a debt of kindness acknowledged and repaid in the only currency they possessed, a shared, unspoken understanding. The wagon rattled into the yard a few days later, unannounced. It wasn't the sheriff. It was Henderson, the man who ran the general store in town, his face perpetually soured by suspicion. With him were two other men, brothers who worked a small, failed plot of land to the south, their eyes small and mean. They carried rifles, not for hunting, but as a statement. Elias was coming from the well, a bucket of water in each hand. He set them down slowly, the water sloshing over the rims. He felt Nolin's presence at the window, a silent, fearful witness. "Thorne," Henderson said, spitting a wad of tobacco near Elias's feet. "We've come to talk some sense into you." The two brothers fanned out, their posture aggressive, proprietary. "The sheriff might be yellow," Henderson continued, "but the rest of us ain't. You can't keep that. That squaw here. It ain't natural. It's a danger to all of us. Elias remained still, his face calm, but a cold, dangerous light had kindled in his eyes. He was a man who had lost everything. He had nothing left to fear from loud men with rifles. "This is my land," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of iron. "You are not welcome here," one of the brothers laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Your land? We was here before you, Thorn. We know what's right. Give her to us. We'll take her where she belongs." He took a step forward, raising his rifle slightly. Nolin's breath caught in her throat. She saw the flash of violence, the old, familiar pattern beginning again. But Elias moved. He did not reach for a gun. He took 2 long strides that covered the distance between them with shocking speed. He grabbed the barrel of the brother's rifle in his massive left hand, wrenching it upward. With his right, he seized the man's shirt front, lifting him effortlessly off his feet. The man dangled there, his face a comical mask of shock and terror, his feet kicking at the air. "Get off my land," Elias said, his voice a low growl, the sound of rock grinding against rock. Now there was no rage in his face, only a cold, absolute finality. It was more terrifying than any shout. He dropped the man, who scrambled backward in the dust like a crab. Henderson and the other brother hesitated, their bluster evaporating in the face of this silent, immense force. They had come expecting to intimidate a grieving hermit. They had found something else entirely, something ancient and unyielding. Without another word, they helped their companion into the wagon and fled, their retreat as cowardly as their arrival had been arrogant. Elias stood watching them go, the dust settling around him. He turned toward the cabin. He had not fought for a principle. He had fought for a person. He had fought for the quiet order of his home. And in doing so, he had finally, truly, begun to live in it again. The confrontation, the sudden spike of fear and adrenaline, was a shock to Nolin's system. That evening, as a bruised twilight settled over the plains, the first pain gripped her, sharp and deep. She gasped, her hands flying to her belly. Elias, cleaning the rifle he had unused, looked up, his senses instantly alert. He saw her face, the sweat beading on her brow, the look of profound inward focus. He knew. At the same time, the weather turned. The wind that had been a whisper all day began to moan, and the sky, which had been clear, filled with dark, fast-moving clouds. A freak autumn blizzard, a thing of brutal and sudden violence, was bearing down on them. Within an hour, the world outside the cabin was a howling chaos of wind and white. They were trapped. The town, the doctor, everything was a world away, buried under a storm that seemed intent on scouring the earth clean. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the calloused shell of Elias's heart. He had faced loss in a quiet, sterile room, helpless against a fever he couldn't see. Now he faced life, raw and elemental, in the heart of a storm, and he was just as helpless. Nolin's pains came closer together, her quiet endurance a thing of awe. She would breathe through them, her eyes closed, her hands gripping the edge of the cot. Between them, she was calm, her instructions to him soft but clear. Water. Clean cloths. He moved about the cabin, his huge body feeling clumsy and useless. He, who could mend any fence, gentle any horse, now fumbled with simple tasks, his hands shaking. He was terrified. Terrified of failing her. Terrified of the ghosts of his own past, who whispered in the howl of the wind. He brought a lantern closer, the golden light pushing back the frantic shadows. He knelt by the cot. He saw not just her pain, but her incredible strength. She was not a victim. She was a warrior, fighting the most fundamental battle of all. He took her hand, his rough, calloused fingers enveloping hers. It was the first time they had touched like this. In that grip, a current passed between them, up of fear, of trust, of shared humanity. The hours blurred into a primal rhythm of pain and release. The storm raged outside, and a storm of equal ferocity raged within the small cabin. Then, as the blizzard reached its peak, a new sound pierced the wind's cry. A thin, wavering, but powerful cry of a newborn. A son. Elias felt the sound in his very bones. It was the sound of a beginning. It shattered the long, silent grief that had encased his heart. He looked down at the tiny, red-faced infant, and then at Nolin, her face exhausted but luminous. In that moment, the ghosts in the room fled. The house was no longer a tomb for his memories. It was a home, filled with the undeniable, miraculous sound of life. The storm broke 2 days later. The world outside the cabin was transformed, buried under a blanket of pristine, silent snow. The light that filtered through the window was different, soft, clean, and full of promise. The silence was different, too. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of grief, but a peaceful quiet, alive with the soft sounds of a newborn's breathing. Elias moved through this new world with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his immense size. He kept the fire stoked, brewed broth for Nolin, and held the baby with a clumsy reverence, his large, scarred finger a marvel against the infant's tiny, grasping hand. He would sit for long stretches, just watching the child sleep, a profound and quiet wonder on his face. The house, which for so long had felt empty and vast, now felt perfectly full. Its purpose, once lost, had been restored. One afternoon, Nolin was awake, propped up against the pillows, nursing her son. Elias sat in his customary chair by the hearth, not working, just being. The quiet between them was now a bond, a shared space of comfort and understanding. He looked over at the child, then at her. "He has your eyes," Elias said, his voice soft, almost a murmur. It was not a simple observation. It was an acknowledgement of her resilience, of the beauty she had brought into his desolate world. Nolin looked from her son's face to the man across the room. She saw past the giant frame, the weathered face, to the deep well of kindness he had so fiercely tried to hide. She saw the man who had stood against the sheriff, who had faced down the armed men, who had stood vigil outside her door in the night. She saw the man who had delivered her son in the heart of a storm. "He has your strength," she replied. Her words were quiet, but they landed with the weight of absolute truth. A home, he was learning, was not a structure of wood and nails. It was not a place you defended. It was a presence you held. It was the sound of another's breath in the quiet of the night. Hope, he realized, was not a grand thing that arrived with trumpets. It was a small, stubborn seed. It could be carried on the wind to the most barren patch of ground, and there, in the scarred and broken earth, it could take root and begin, impossibly, to grow.